The moment Isabella Carter heard her husband laugh behind the closed doors of his study, something inside her turned cold. It was not the warm laugh she had heard on their wedding day in the small white church in Charleston. It was not the soft sound he made when guests congratulated them, or when he held her hand in public. This laugh was sharp and distant. It was the kind of laugh a man makes when he believes he is safe from being heard. Isabella had been walking down the long hallway of Blackwood Manor with a folded letter pressed to her chest. The doctor in town had written it himself that morning. His handwriting had been careful and clear. She had read the words 3 times before leaving his office. 6 weeks pregnant, healthy, strong heartbeat. She had imagined how she would tell her husband. She had pictured his surprise, or maybe even joy. She thought he would lift her in his arms. She believed this child would bring them closer. But now she stood frozen outside the heavy oak door of his study. The door was not fully shut. It stood slightly open, just enough for voices to slip through. She should have walked away. She should have knocked. A proper wife did not stand in corridors listening. But something in his laughter held her still. The house felt different suddenly. The long red carpet under her feet seemed endless. The portraits on the walls watched her in silence. Outside, rain hit the tall windows, covering the small sounds she made as she moved closer. "Come on, Jonathan. You cannot tell us the marriage is truly that empty." The voice belonged to Edward Prescott, her husband's closest friend. Isabella remembered him from the wedding reception 3 months ago. He had toasted to love and loyalty. "Empty would require feeling," Jonathan replied. "I do not feel anything at all." The words landed so hard in her chest that she nearly dropped the letter. Her fingers tightened around it until the paper wrinkled. Another man spoke. "William Harper." She recognized his deep voice. "You had your choice of women in this county, half of them prettier, most with stronger families. Why her?" Silence followed. Isabella could hear the crackle of the fireplace inside the room. She could hear the sound of glass touching glass as someone poured another drink. She could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. When Jonathan finally spoke, his voice was calm. "She was the easiest decision I ever made. She in with land." What the hallway tilted around her. Land. Edward laughed softly. "Surely not just land. She seems gentle enough." "Well-behaved, gentle," Jonathan repeated. "Yes." "That is a fair word. She is gentle, quiet, plain. But her father's property borders mine on 3 sides. When we married, it all became one estate. Timber rights, river access, mining shares. More than most men will ever own." Isabella pressed her hand against the wall to steady herself. The stone felt cold against her skin. "So it was business," William said. "Of course it was business," Jonathan answered. "Her father was desperate. Everyone knew her prospects were limited. When I offered marriage, he agreed before I finished speaking. I barely had to negotiate." The men laughed again. Isabella felt heat rush to her face. Plain. Limited prospects. She had never believed herself beautiful, but she had hoped she was enough. She had tried so hard these last 3 months. She had memorized Jonathan's favorite meals. She had learned the names of every worker on the estate. She had practiced speaking with confidence at dinners, so she would not embarrass him. And all of it had meant nothing. "What about the girl herself?" Edward asked. "Does she bore you?" There was a short pause. "I barely notice her," Jonathan said. "She stays in her rooms, reads her little poems, does whatever wives do. I appear beside her at dinner. We attend church together. That is enough. She is part of the estate now, like the horses or the furniture, necessary for an heir one day. Nothing more." The letter in Isabella's hand suddenly felt heavier than iron. 6 weeks. that she was already carrying the heir he spoke of as if it were another purchase. "I must say, Jonathan," William continued, "you hide it well. At the Bennett ball last week you looked devoted." "That is called good manners," Jonathan replied. "Society expects a man to look proud of his wife. I play my role, she plays hers. It keeps everything simple." "Does she know?" Edward asked quietly. "That it was only for the property?" "Of course not," Jonathan said with a small laugh. "She writes poetry about love. She believes in grand feelings. It is better she stays happy. A content wife causes no trouble." Isabella felt something inside her break open. He had read her poetry, the small leather notebook she had searched for last week. He had taken it. He had read her private words and laughed about them. "Cold keeps a man strong," Jonathan added. "Feelings only make you weak. My father taught me that before he died. Every decision must bring profit. I chose well." Profit. Isabella had woken each morning believing she was building a life. She had believed she was loved. Now she understood she had been a transaction. For a moment she thought she might collapse. The hallway felt too narrow, the air too thin. But instead of tears, something else rose in her chest. It started small, then grew steady and hot. Not sadness, not fear. Something clearer. She bent slowly and picked up the letter she had almost dropped. She smoothed it carefully against her skirt. The doctor's words were still there. Confirmation of pregnancy. Estimated delivery in early spring. Her hand moved to her flat stomach. Jonathan considered her furniture. He believed she was gentle and simple and unaware. Well, he was wrong. Inside the study, the men began talking about hunting season, about railroad expansion, about investments. They had already moved on from her. Isabella stood very still for several seconds. The rain continued against the windows. The house seemed to breathe around her. Then she turned away from the door. She walked down the hallway without making a sound. Her back was straight. Her steps were slow and careful. Behind her, her husband laughed again. He had no idea that the quiet wife he barely noticed had just heard every word. He had no idea that she carried his child. He had no idea that something inside her had changed forever. By the time Isabella reached the far end of the corridor, her hands were no longer shaking. Her breathing was calm. If he believed marriage was a transaction, yet then she would learn the terms of it fully. If he believed she was too simple to understand estate matters, then he would soon discover how wrong he had been. She slipped the doctor's letter into the pocket of her dress. She would not confront him tonight. She would not cry in front of his friends. She would not beg for affection that had never been real. Instead, she would think. She would plan. Jonathan Carter believed he had gained land and secured his future. But he had just made one mistake. He had underestimated his wife. The rain had stopped by the time Isabella reached the eastern wing of Blackwood Manor, but water still dripped from the roof in a slow, steady rhythm. The sound followed her as she moved through the narrow servants' corridor, a hidden passage she had discovered during her first lonely week in the house. But back then she had wandered out of curiosity. Now she moved with purpose. The estate office waited at the end of the north hallway. Jonathan spent hours there each morning, reviewing ledgers and signing documents. On the day he had shown her the room after their wedding, he had smiled politely and told her she need not concern herself with such matters. Then he had guided her out before she could ask a single question. She stopped outside the office door. Her hand hovered over the brass handle. A proper wife did not enter her husband's private office without permission. A proper wife did not search through contracts. But a proper wife was not compared to furniture. She opened the door. The room smelled of leather and tobacco. Heavy curtains blocked most of the light. The dark wood shelves reached from floor to ceiling, filled with thick ledgers labeled by year. The large desk stood in the center, neat and organized, every paper stacked with care. For a moment she stood still, listening. The house was quiet. Jonathan and his friends had gone riding. She had time. She moved to the desk first. The top drawer was locked. The others held ordinary items. Sealing wax, spare pens, a silver letter opener engraved with the Carter crest. Nothing useful. Her eyes lifted to the shelves. She pulled down a ledger at random. In Estate Revenues 1888. The pages were filled with columns of numbers and notes she struggled to follow. She replaced it carefully and tried another. Property transfers. Then, tenant agreements. Nothing mentioned her. Then she noticed a leather portfolio tucked behind several older books on the lowest shelf. It looked newer than the rest. Her heart began to beat faster as she carried it to the desk. Inside were legal documents tied together with a dark ribbon. On the top page were words that made her breath stop. Marriage settlement between the estate of Henry Whitaker and Jonathan Carter of Blackwood Manor. Her father's name, her husband's name. She untied the ribbon slowly and began to read. The language was formal and difficult, but certain phrases stood out clearly. Transfer of title, exclusive mineral rights, water access, timber holdings, complete absorption into the Carter estate. Page after page listed the lands that had once belonged to her father. Not gifted to her, not protected for her, signed away. Then she reached a clause near the end. In the event that no male heir is produced within 5 years of the date of marriage, Isabella Whitaker Carter may be lawfully set aside. All transferred properties shall remain permanently under Carter ownership. Her fingers tightened on the page. Set aside. The words were calm and legal, but their meaning was cruel. If she did not give Jonathan a son within 5 years, he could cast her away and keep everything. She would leave with nothing. 5 years to prove her worth. A strange calm settled over her. She placed her hand over her stomach again. 6 weeks. He did not yet know she carried his child. But if she told him now, he would see it only as success, a completed bargain. He would own her more completely than before. But if she waited, she would have time. Time to understand every detail of this agreement. Time to prepare. Footsteps echoed in the hallway outside. Her breath caught in her throat. She pushed the papers back into the portfolio, her hand suddenly clumsy. The footsteps grew louder. She recognized Jonathan's voice. He was returning. There was no second door, no quick escape. In her panic, she knocked the portfolio from the desk. Papers scattered across the floor. The doorknob turned. With no time left, Isabella gathered what she could and rushed behind the heavy velvet curtains that framed the tall window. She pressed herself flat against the cold glass as the door opened. I am telling you, Edward, the railroad will double the value within 2 years, Jonathan said as he stepped inside. Their boots crossed the wooden floor. Another set of footsteps followed. I admit it was a clever arrangement, Edward replied, though I do feel a small amount of pity for your wife. Do not waste it, Jonathan answered calmly. She has comfort, a title, security. That is more than most women receive. Isabella held her breath. The thick fabric brushed against her face. She could see their shadows moving across the room. Does she understand how much her father gave up? Edward asked. Jonathan laughed softly. Of course not. Why would I trouble her with legal details? She is too meek to question anything. Meek. The word burned hotter than the others. And even if she entered this office, Jonathan continued, She would not understand the contracts. I know my wife. She is exactly as I need her to be. Quiet, grateful, unaware. Behind the curtain, something inside Isabella hardened. She had spent months trying to be small so he would feel comfortable. She had softened her opinions. She had hidden her intelligence. She had believed love required patience. Now she understood patience had only made her invisible. Something scraped across the floor. "What happened here?" Jonathan asked. "Probably the wind," Edward replied. "The window must be loose." Isabella pressed harder against the glass, praying it would not move. They gathered the scattered pages and placed them back on the desk. After a few more minutes of talk about investments, the men left the room again. Silence returned. Isabella counted slowly to 100 before stepping out from behind the curtain. Her legs felt stiff, but her mind was clear. The portfolio had been returned to the shelf. Most of the papers were in place, but on the corner of the desk lay one single sheet that had not been collected. She walked toward it carefully. It was a letter written in Jonathan's handwriting. The date was from 2 weeks earlier. "My dearest Clara," it began. The rest of the words blurred for a moment before she forced herself to read. Clara lived in Savannah. Jonathan visited town twice each week under the excuse of business meetings. He wrote of longing, of missing her company, of counting days until he could return. The tenderness in his writing was something he had never once shown his wife. Isabella did not cry. She folded the letter neatly and slipped it into her dress. Now she understood everything. He had married for land, when he kept a mistress for affection. He expected obedience from one and pleasure from another, and he believed both women would remain silent. When she left the office, she did not hurry. She walked back to her rooms with calm steps. That night, while Jonathan dined in town, Isabella sat alone at her writing desk. A candle burned low beside her. She placed the letter from Clara into the flame. The paper curled and blackened until nothing remained but ash. She did not burn it from jealousy. She burned it because she no longer needed proof. The plan had already begun forming in her mind. Earlier that afternoon, she had searched through old boxes in the attic that once belonged to her mother. Inside, she found documents that Jonathan had overlooked. Property passed down through her mother's family, and a small coastal cottage in North Carolina, shares in a textile mill in Pennsylvania, investments in a shipping company based in New York. These had never belonged to her father. They had never been part of the marriage settlement. They were hers. The discovery felt like light breaking through heavy clouds. She had her own means, her own income. Jonathan believed he had secured everything, but he had not secured her entire world. Isabella pulled fresh paper toward her and began to write letters. She wrote to the manager of the mill, to the shipping company directors, to the caretaker of the coastal cottage. She signed her own name with steady confidence. Then she placed her hand once more over her stomach. This child would not grow up believing love was a bargain. Jonathan Carter believed every relationship was a transaction, yet he had calculated the value of land and timber and water, but he had failed to calculate one thing: the strength of the quiet woman he had chosen to underestimate. 2 days later, Isabella received her answers. The replies arrived quietly, delivered with the morning mail as if they were ordinary letters. But they carried more power than any document Jonathan kept locked in his office. The manager of the textile mill confirmed steady profits and assured her that dividends had been set aside in her name for years. The shipping company directors expressed surprise that the granddaughter of their original investor had finally written. They welcomed her involvement and promised full financial reports. The caretaker of the coastal cottage wrote that the house overlooked the Atlantic, small but strong, and could be prepared within a week. Isabella read each letter slowly. She felt something settle inside her chest that she had not felt since before her wedding. Safety. That evening, Jonathan entered her room without knocking. He looked slightly irritated, as though her private space were an inconvenience. "I will be traveling to Savannah next week," he said. "Business matters. I will be gone 10 days. Isabella folded the last letter calmly. "Of course," she replied. "I hope your business is successful." He studied her for a moment. "You seem unusually content." "I have been thinking," she said softly. "It is helpful to understand exactly what one's place is." Something flickered in his expression. Perhaps confusion, perhaps discomfort. But it passed quickly. "A wife who understands her position keeps a peaceful household," he said. "Indeed," she answered. After he left, Isabella began packing. She did not pack much, only what belonged to her: her mother's jewelry, her father's old pocket watch, a few dresses, her poetry notebook, the medical letter confirming her pregnancy. She wrote one final note and placed it in an envelope addressed to Jonathan. "Jonathan, by the time you read this, I will be gone from Blackwood Manor. I am not asking permission. I am informing you of a decision. You married me for land. I understand that clearly now. You believed I would remain quiet and grateful, unaware of what was signed away in my name. You were mistaken. I am carrying your child, 6 weeks along, the heir you spoke of so casually. But this child will not grow up in a house where love is measured in acres and profit. The properties from my mother's family were never yours. I have claimed them. I will build a life there. You may keep every inch of land you gained from my father. I want nothing from Blackwood Manor. Do not attempt to find me. Isabella." She sealed the letter carefully and left it on his desk in the estate office, resting against the very ledger where he recorded his acquisitions. At dawn, a carriage waited in the rear courtyard. Mrs. Thompson, the housekeeper, stood beside it with tears in her eyes. "You are certain, ma'am?" she whispered. "I am certain," Isabella replied. Mrs. Thompson pressed a small pouch of coins into her hand. "Then, go with courage." The carriage rolled away from Blackwood Manor just as the sun rose over the fields. Isabella did not look back immediately. She waited until the gates had nearly disappeared behind them. The house stood tall and gray against the morning sky, imposing, cold. For the first time since her wedding day, she felt light. The journey to the coast took several days. When she arrived, the cottage was simple but strong, sitting on a cliff that overlooked endless blue water. The air smelled of salt and freedom. Waves struck the rocks below in steady rhythm. It was not a grand estate. It did not carry a title, but it was hers. Months passed quietly. Isabella managed her investments through letters. The mill profits continued. The shipping dividends arrived each quarter. She learned to balance accounts herself. She hired a local woman to help with the house. She walked along the shore each evening, speaking softly to the child growing inside her. Winter faded into spring. One afternoon, as sunlight poured through the cottage windows, her daughter was born. A daughter. Isabella held the tiny child against her chest and felt tears fill her eyes for the first time in many months. Not tears of pain, tears of gratitude. She named her Catherine, after her grandmother, the woman who had wisely kept her property separate and had quietly secured her granddaughter's future. Catherine had dark hair like her father, but her eyes were Isabella's. Strong, observant. As she rocked her newborn beside the open window, listening to the ocean below, Isabella thought of Jonathan Carter. She imagined the moment he had read her letter, the shock, the anger, perhaps even the fear of losing control. He had calculated every part of their marriage. He had measured land, timber, and profit. But he had forgotten one truth. In any transaction, both parties have the power to walk away. She had walked away. Years later, Catherine would grow up knowing the full story. She would understand that her mother had once stood behind a closed door and heard words that could have broken her forever. Instead, those words had set her free. Isabella no longer felt bitterness when she remembered that hallway at Blackwood Manor. She felt gratitude for the moment she had been forced to see the truth. Yet because the bravest choice she ever made was not marrying for love. It was choosing herself when she realized love had never been offered at all.